even within the inequitable situation. You have an inequitable situation, but then you have disparities within that. And so what I think that we have not hit bottom. I think that it could possibly get worse. And we need to be thinking about ways to try to intervene in order to address those inequities and inequalities. And as a historian, I've been, trying to research, trying to understand when interventions took place and when those interventions actually brought about some kind of improvement or advancement in the situation. And so, so my research on reparations movement, but the African American history in general, but reparations movement has given me hope, in terms of what can possibly be done by focusing in on the least of these. Focusing in on the least of these. Let us try to see what we can do to try to improve this situation, to address the disparities for the least of these. And among the least of these are African American children. And so that if we say, okay, these, least of these, and African American children have all of these disparities in terms of education, outcome, income, economic well-being. If you deal with them, then that specifically dealing with the disparities and inequalities for the least of these, then ultimately, a lot of times, this will mean that it will be an improvement, not just for African-American children or children of color, it will be improvements for everyone in the society. And we have historical evidence that that is what happens when you focus in on trying to repair the damage that has been done to the least of these. Ultimately, what happens is that you produce circumstances and institutions and conditions that improve others in the society, and ultimately bring about success in improving the well-being for not just the children of color, but in the society at large. And I can give you an example of this.
Please.
You know that during the because my work is on the 1960s, and you have all of the protests and riots and marches and demonstrations, et cetera. And these protests led to certain government programs, such as Head Start. Okay, now remember, Head Start was a program that began to try to deal with the conditions for children of color, poor children. It was for poor children, but not just children, but poor children, to try to improve their condition and to prepare them to enter the first grade. Okay. Now, Head Start and pre-kindergarten education was, and all of these early education was not a focus in the society at large. It wasn't a focus in the society. So by focusing in on trying to deal with the conditions faced by these impoverished children of color, we recognize the need for pre-kindergarten education, early childhood education. It's, and this is for children in the society at large. And so so what I'm saying is that if we say that, okay, we want to gear our reparatory justice activities and programs and interventions to try to deal with the conditions facing these children, the disparities that these children of color, impoverished children of color are facing, ultimately that will redound to the benefits of the entire society. By they will be improved and others. And then so you can identify specific things that need to be improved so that the the emphasis in the reparations movement is to intervene, to provide reparations to deal with these specific disparities for specific groups.
That makes sense. And you just wrote an article, I think in May, an op-ed for the ACLU about the Georgetown experience. Is that right? Is that another example of a...
Of reparatory justice and reparations, right? Yes, that was a situation where the church, where the school, Georgetown University, held people in enslavement, were in financial trouble. Then, to try to get out of that financial trouble, they literally sold 272 people down the river, literally down the river, and they ended up in Western Louisiana, in southwestern Louisiana. And the descendants of those African Americans who were enslaved by Georgetown, sold by Georgetown University, ended up in southern Louisiana. When they were made aware of the situation, and people said, well, you know, they are still impoverished. These people, in other words, their situation in southwestern Louisiana in the 21st century is comparable to the situation that their ancestors were in the 19th century, in terms of impoverishment, disparities, health challenges, these kinds of things. In other words, that act of transferring and benefiting from the enslavement and selling of those people redounded back into the 21st century, where these people are still impoverished and still have lack of education, et cetera. And so when that was revealed, they organized themselves into the GU 272 group, these descendants, and they appealed to the administration at Georgetown University for reparatory justice, for reparations for the conditions under which they have been forced to live as a result of the benefit that went to Georgetown University through the sale of their ancestors. And initially, Georgetown University said, oh, well, we understand, we can identify the people and all of this. And they said that they would initially think about assisting them in education. In other words, the first gesture was to allow these descendants of those enslaved ancestors to enroll at Georgetown University with some kind of scholarship. And a few of them actually did. But the question was, but what about those GU 272 descendants who didn't necessarily want to go to Georgetown University? They may want to go to LSU. So that, that was not just, so they pressed it. They pressed it more. And they said, okay, well, we're thinking about, well, perhaps we will allow some kind of fund for descendants to have education, develop their education, improve their education, et cetera. But that was just a very small amount. It only affected a few people. Meanwhile, the undergraduates at Georgetown University saw that the university's administration was dragging its feet in terms of providing some kind of compensation to people who were the descendants of those who were enslaved and sent to Louisiana. And the undergraduate students at Georgetown voted to increase their student fees by a certain amount to increase the funds that would be available to the GU 7272 people, the families, the students, etc. And then the university itself said, okay, well, we will try to expand up, increase this fund and try to help them. But that's just the Georgetown University is one of the most well-known, the best known of these kinds of incidents. But there have been other schools, Brown University, Virginia Theological Seminary. There have been other schools that have recognized that their wealth was laid, the foundation for their wealth was laid in slavery and enslaved labor. And so therefore, they want to say that, okay, this condition, the condition of slavery and the use of slave labor has continued to disadvantage those who had been enslaved and their descendants. And so therefore, we will try to deal with the remaining disparities. This is the situation that exists, that it's 100, 150, 160 years after the end of slavery, but the disparities in income, in education, in wealth, in health conditions, they still exist. And so that would be a moral activity of reparatory justice that would try to repair the damage that had been done to these people and to their ancestors that still exist in contemporary society.
Yes, and one thing that strikes me about the Georgetown effort is what you just said, that it was ultimately driven by the students, the young people there. And I know that the book that you're working on and finishing right now is about exactly that, the youth in the civil rights movement, right? And so, yes. And so I guess my question is, do you see that as like one of the possible driving forces for what can change, how we can make change now?
Well, yes, I do. I definitely think that. And so as the editor of the Journal of African American History, I had been publishing articles and special issues on reparations movements, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. Since 2012, I initially issued a call for papers for the 2012 special issue that was issued in the winter of 2009. So, and I had already published reviews of books on reparations, such as Mary Frances Berry's book, which came out in 2005, My Face is Black, Callie House and the Ex-Slave Reparations Movement. That came out in 2005, and we did a whole symposium on that book in 2006. So I had been dealing with the issue, in the journal for many years. And then in 2012, the special issue came out on African Americans and movements for reparations. And I tried to send it out to people and stuff. And I don't know, there wasn't as much response. It was in the pre-Black Lives Matter era. Okay, so it was in 2012, so we're talking about 2012, 13, that was before that. So at that point, I said that, well, basically, my research has revealed that you really, in order for these, some kind of change in movement, social movement to advance, it's going to have to depend on the young people. The young people are going to have to take up this, I can write about reparations in the journal, a scholarly journal. We can have other scholars, writing about it, debating about it, et cetera. But it would have to become something that more like a mass movement for people to take advantage, to actually bring about some kind of change. And so that's when I decided that, okay, well, what I will do is I will research what children and teenagers did during the civil rights movement, that brought about all of those social and economic change in order to provide information to young people today about how they can contribute to the pressing social and ecological issues that they are facing. And so the summary of the approach or the theme that I'm pursuing in the Young Crusaders, because that's basically what you had. Because I'm dealing with, because you have to remember, you had the book actually deals with the issue, sort of like answers to questions. They say, okay, if the children in Birmingham, we've all seen the images, the videos, et cetera, of what the children and teenagers in Birmingham did in 1963 to try to advance the civil rights movement. Okay, most of you have seen those images of the tacks and the hoses and the gauze and all of that. And then with thousands of children who were arrested. So the question is, the book then answers the question, well, if that's what they did in Birmingham, what did children and teenagers do in other places? Okay, so that's basically what I'm documenting, what children, and as I say, there are over 50 cities that I discuss in the book in terms of what the children, the high school students, the elementary school students did to try to advance civil rights campaigns and goals and objectives during the 1950s and 1960s. Okay, so that's, and the chant at the time. Some of you who were around at that time will know that the chant in all those marches and protests and demonstrations, the major chant was "Freedom Now." Freedom Now was what they chanted. Freedom Now, it's in posters and buttons and chanting and rallies, et cetera. Freedom Now was what the children and the adults were seeking in the protests. So what I'm saying that, okay, but now in the 2020s, the movement has begun and it's been taken up by various agencies, by various institutions, by the government, by the churches, and so that the children's, the chant in the 2020s should be reparations now. And the reparations now, that's the chant that the young people can take up and say that the reparations are not just to deal with the economic and social and educational inequities that exist in the society as a result of the institutional racism that exists in society, and to deal with the damage that has been created as a result of the systemic racism that exists in the society. But also to deal with with repairing the damage that has been done to the air, the damage that has been done to the water, the damage that has been done to the physical environment. In other words, reparatory justice as an objective and as a cause is to repair damage that is due to racial inequities, racism inequities, et cetera, but also to the damage that is being done to our planet, to our air, to our water. So in other words, what I'm suggesting needs to be done, and Jane Fonda was the other person that suggested this in her new book. In her new book that just came out, she said, is that if you define the movement toward reparatory justice, we want to repair damage that has been done, okay? Then you will be able to combine the objectives of the movements for racial justice with the movements for climate, to deal with climate change, with the environment, because we need to repair the damage. And so repair the damage that has been done. And that's what the young people have already begun to demonstrate that they are with. So in other words, we put this in a reparatory justice framework and combine the the demonstration and protests that was associated with the need for racial justice and to combat police brutality, but also to repair our environment and to actually target particular industries and particular corporations, particular businesses for reparations that will improve our environment, to deal with the damage. I liked some of these quotes in terms of the young people. There was an article, I just would have to be reading an article that in the special issue of the New York Times Magazine that was on warming of the planet and the migrants. And there was an article by called Echo Anxious. And that's the, let's see, the date is July 26th, New York Times Magazine. It's an article called Echo Anxious. And there's an interview with Jamie Margolin, who is an 18-year-old who heads up the environmental group Zero Hour. And I thought this was this is one way that you could think about it from the standpoint of the young people. It says, now 18, Jamie Margolin has been helping to run this organization, Zero Hour, where leadership and core organizers communicate, has more than 100 members. She met politicians. That's not the quote. Yeah, okay, that's not the quote I want. All right, so this is the group. So she says, when adults ask her, as they often do, when she first became worried about climate change, Margolin has a go-to answer. Climate change, she explains, is like Beyonce. When you're a member of her generation, both are facts of life, things that you just know. Fundamental to the way the world functions. There was definitely a time when I first heard of climate change, Margolis said, just as she wasn't birthed knowing Beyonce. But in neither case can she remember a moment of first awareness. For her and her peers, Beyonce has simply always existed. And so has the fear of growing up and making a life in a world rendered unrecognizable by climate change. Mm-hmm. Okay, so for young people, climate change is as real as Beyonce. It's all they know. They've always had it. It's always existed for them. And it's something that they have to deal with.
Yeah, and I mean, that's exactly right. And that whole generation is growing up with that, and also with the racial inequities as something that has been present for their whole experience, right? And I wanted to go back to one thing that you've also written about, and also in comparing this issue to the climate change issue. One form of reparatory justice, I think you wrote, could be a super fund, much like what they set up in the Gulf when BP had that big oil spill. You know, they set up a big sort of cleanup fund to do all different kinds of things. And I think that you had imagined that could also perhaps be set up to again, handle on the racial equity side, all different kinds of things and all kinds of damages that have been done over time. Do I have that right?
Yeah, oh yes, I'm hoping that will be the case, that because, as you know, there have been, as a result of the protests and the demonstrations, et cetera, there have been donations made by various corporations to various groups to try to deal with specific problems, et cetera. And those, I guess those donations, I mean, Nike, Amazon, Walmart, all of them have come up with these donations to try to deal with some kind of racial inequity, some kind of racial problem that exists. And so, but we should not confuse philanthropy with reparations.
Right.
So that's philanthropy. But reparations would be specifically to deal with the damage, to repair damage that exists. We have identified a specific problem that exists for this group, for these people in our society, and we will create a fund, a large fund, wherein many corporations could donate to, as well as the government, they could donate to repair this particular problem, this damage that exists. So that if you had a reparations fund, you can have a super fund, you can have it to deal with pollution. They deal specifically with pollution that was created by a specific company. In other words, you can target it. You can say this company has participated, and I'm not gonna name any companies like Exxon or anything. I'm just gonna say that this company, they specifically cause these kinds of damage to the environment, to a society, to a group, to a location. And you set up a reparations fund to deal specifically with that. And at the same time, the young people, and if Exxon say, we're not going to come up with the billions of dollars to do this, to repair the damage that Exxon had done to this specific community, to this specific group, you say, oh, okay, well, then I guess we need to turn to the mass movement of young people. The young people then participate. In other words, with reparations now as the objective, the large objective is to create a mass movement where pressure can be put on the government, on these corporations, in order to repair the damage that they have done to Black communities, to Black people, et cetera, but also damage that they have done to the environment. So in other words, and if they don't, and if they say, oh no, well, we give we give philanthropic funds all the time to different groups. Look, we give to the historically Black colleges. We give this money and say okay, all right, say, but then you have to target them. You have to target them the way that the children targeted groups and organizations in the 1960s with boycotts, with strikes, just like the climate strike. The climate strike has demonstrated people's willingness to participate in these kinds of activities. But it needs to be targeted. It needs to be targeted, and the young people are the ones who will be the ones who will define what needs to be done and what to improve their futures, to target, and then to say, okay, everyone who supports our efforts to try to repair the damage that these corporations have done to our society will support us in whatever actions, political, social actions we take. And so in other words, you can create these reparations super funds that are going to deal with a specific problem and target a specific institution or organization to provide the funds to repair that particular damage. And if they do not, if they, they're reluctant to do this, then you can have mass movement behind it and launch boycotts, because that is the missing element in the young people's movement today.
Right.
This is, they're, in the past, they had all these, we all remember the lettuce boycotts and, et cetera, in the 1960s. But we have not, that has not been part of their nonviolent direct action protest activity today. More recently, let's put it. So that's something that they can get behind and support. And for example, one of the things that I would hope that the young people would do, given the situation that we're in the pandemic, is that the students decide that they, rather than having the testing corporations take from the school district, take money from the school district, and not give anything but test results. That since they're not taking tests. Right. So the students can organize and say, hey, we won't take the test unless the testing company that decide that will be introduced into this district provides computers, provides support for teachers, provides funds for trips, for buses, for, et cetera. In other words, create scholarships. That is, at this point, they're not taking tests. And so they said, well, what will it take for us to begin taking tests again? And the testing industry could be targeted by the young people, creating a reparations super fund, and that fund would then provide a lot of these missing needed resources in these school districts. Right. This testing corporation do not provide, they just take money from the district. The students are in a position to target the testing companies and to have them deliver something to that district if they want those tests to be utilized in that district. Otherwise, they don't take them. Yep. So that's an example of how the students could say that, okay, we want to improve our educational condition. What would be a source of income other than the government? The testing industry. Yep. That's another source, and they are particularly vulnerable now. So let's see what they can come up with in order to improve the educational resources, improve the educational outcomes in districts where their tests are utilized.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So I would like to open it up for questions. I have a million more myself, but I'm sure lots of participants here do. So I wanted to give someone else a chance. And Bill, I don't know if you can unmic when people have questions.
Yeah, I think first of all, you can unmute yourselves, and if you want to type something in the chat, I'll be monitoring that as well. Dr. Franklin, I think maybe I'll kick us off. One thing that struck me about your comments were how you're linking, thinking about racial inequity and reparatory justice in response to racial inequities, but you're also bringing in other forms of inequity, so economic inequality, environmental damage, and really connecting those impulses to other movements. I'm wondering, just thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, if we can call it that, is there, what would you say to, first of all, is there a tension with folks saying, well, that's diluting the reparations movement? You're changing the focus to something that isn't, the descendants of slaves, and you're diluting the movement. Do you hear that? And what's your answer to that kind of concern?
Yes, I think you have to keep in mind that basically all of the major Black Lives Matter groups have endorsed reparations. In all of their published statements, et cetera, they have endorsed reparations. That's reparations. But what I'm suggesting is that that reparations would be like the compensation, but reparatory justice would be the moral principle, the larger moral principle that's operating. And once you accept the larger principle of reparatory justice, then you can have more, you can expand those who will be supporting your movement. In other words, those who are trying, in Black Lives Matter, that are trying to get support for reparations for people of color, for African Americans, on the people of color, they have allies in the environmental justice movement. So in other words, you're trying to create this mass movement that would be geared toward dealing with the damage that needs to be repaired in the society at large. So in other words, you're opening up, and that on the basis of the moral principle, not just, you want reparations, yes, and you want that, but at the same time, you are creating potential allies in support of the movement for Black lives and the movements for to deal with the racial inequities in the society, so that it's enlarging the movement.
Great, thank you. So we're getting lots of raised hands and a number of comments. So I'm just going to call in order. So John Ross, did you have a question?
I do. And I just want to thank you, Professor Franklin, for coming in. This is just a real treat for us, and I just have so much to say, but I wanted to throw something out and get your thoughts on it. We have in our recent food distribution, we've had the intersection, the opportunity to intersect with a lot of Montgomery County police officers. They're very engaged with wanting to help with our traffic and all of that in this thing. And I'm recognizing that we have an opportunity here somehow to work with them. And I don't know how, but I just wanted to hear if you had any thoughts and could steer us towards ways that we might think about as a faith community, working with our police force to work with them on changing culture and on talking about these critically important issues of racial inequity. How do we go about doing that when we have, there's an opportunity here? What should we think about? How do we do that?
Well, I would, in the book, I have a chapter that deals with police brutality and in the 1960s and as a source of sparks for the rioting that took place as a result of the police brutality, and the young people being at the forefront of these riots and stuff. So I have that in there. But there was also in the 1960s, and I don't know if you still have it, you had PAL, the Police Athletic League. I know they had that in Philadelphia. We had that in Philadelphia, the Police Athletic League, PAL programs. And so that there is a existing institution, Police Athletic League, that tried to bridge the community, the young people in the community, and the police force. And a lot of times they did it around athletic programs. And so are there police athletic leagues in your area that you could support and have your church support what the police athletic league is doing? Or if there's not a police athletic league, then there could be athletic programs and institutions and organizations, et cetera, that can serve as a link that would bring together the young people in a particular neighborhood and the police. And so trying to make that connection, positive connection to facilitate that positive connection between the police and the community. I think that I don't know what the situation is with the police athlete. I don't know if it still exists I know that I belong to it, that I was part of it in Philadelphia growing up. But it could serve as a model of a way that the church supporting a positive program associated with the police force that's dealing with the community. So I think that's where I would look at. I would look at, you know, where are the police and the community coming together, and what could your church do to enhance that, to improve that, to expand that kind of action, and therefore increasing police community understanding and relationships. That's what I would do.
So
Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Dr. Franklin, I'm going to draw on something that came in the group chat. Let me start by framing it. So, and I think it's a good segue to what you were just talking about in terms of local activism. So the question is from Martina Conroy, and she says, local PTAs often partner with sister schools to provide resources such as book and coat drives, field trip funding, etc. And the question is, do you know of any movements on a national level, the national PTA, to do this? I mean, in thinking of how you spoke eloquently about the testing companies and resistance to the tyranny of SAT tests, right? You didn't put it that way, but that's how I heard it. So
that's the way I put it in the book.
Okay. So any thoughts, anything you're aware of in terms of national PTA activism in this area?
Let's see. I think that the organization that would have that kind of information on parent-teacher activity and stuff would be the American Educational Research Association, AERA. That's the national organization for educational researchers. It has like 22,000 members or something like that, but it has all of these divisions. It has divisions within that organization. And within that organization, they have an entire division devoted to parental involvement, programs involving parents and teachers together, engaged in activities to try to improve the educational environment. So, what I would recommend is that you go to AERA, the AERA, American Educational Research Association website, and then go in and look under the divisions. They have like 10, 12 divisions. And then there's a whole division that deals with and so these are the researchers, so that they'll give you the articles and the programs, et cetera, that have been published, articles that have been published, and the researchers in that field who are working in this area. And there's a whole division devoted to community school relations and with examples of programs and projects that are underway now or have been underway in the past. So that's where I would turn to get specific researched information on parent-teacher coordination and cooperation and projects that they could engage in, because that is the large organization that encompasses the entire nation and researchers from the entire nation, and so they would have a lot to draw upon in terms of providing you models and examples of it. So that's where I would go, AERA.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to some of the raised hands now. So Margaret Uhar, you have your hand raised. Did you want to ask a question? If so, go ahead and unmute yourself.
No, thanks. That was a mistake. I didn't have a question, but I'm enjoying the discussion very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, let me go back down to the chat. So we had Annalise Hafer offered a comment. At every level of the criminal justice system, studies have shown that Black people suffer disproportionately. Black people are incarcerated at 3.6 times the rate of white people. How can we address this disparity and reduce mass incarceration? Thoughts or comments?
Well, mass incarceration is definitely horror, and it's also very expensive. And so now they're recognizing that that was not such a good idea, that we have to figure out how to decrease the prison population. I'm currently in Louisiana, And Louisiana had the dubious distinction of having the largest incarceration rate in the world, based on its population for many, many years. I think it's been bad going back and forth between Mississippi and Louisiana in terms of who has the worst statistics on incarceration. But now, of course, they're realizing in Louisiana and in Mississippi that was a drain on the budgets, drain on the states. It was unnecessary that they were placing too many people in prison and in jail for minor infractions and minor crimes, and so they're backing off on that. Oh no, well we need to reevaluate this and stuff. And I have thought in terms of reparations as being an alternative to reparations programs to provide alternatives for young people who may become caught up in the mass incarceration. In other words, and so specifically, I am interested in using the reparations super funds to support programs for young people that would provide alternatives to the violence, to gun violence specifically. There was the horrible statements by Attorney General Barr, who made this statement about how, the police aren't killing Black people. It's Black people are killing Black people. Black on Black crime is the problem, and that's why we have the high incarceration rate. But white people kill white people. So if you look at that, certain Black people aren't killing white people. That's what they say, because we hear about that. So that's not the issue. That's not the problem. The problem is the young people that are caught up in gun violence, and that the young people that are exposed to the gun violence, et cetera, and exposed to it, but also victimized by it. And so what we need to do is to intervene in those community, among those young people, so that they will not resort to gun violence to settle issues, and because they will find that it is no longer in their interest to participate in these kinds of violence, this kind of activities, because they have alternatives. They have job programs. They have educational programs. They have jobs. They have jobs, etc. In other words, we have various kinds of models for intervening in communities and providing support, counseling, prevention of violence. We have all kinds of models for those kinds of things. And then that, therefore, would then decrease incarceration. It would, that would have an impact on the incarceration rate. I have worked on, it's really as a historian, my process as a historian. I did research on a program that was started in Philadelphia, North Philadelphia, in the late 1940s and 1950s. And it was called Operation Street Corner. Operation Street Corner. And this is where you had gang activities in these areas, but you hired street corner workers, usually college students, to work with the young people in a particular area, counsel them about educational and employment opportunities, and tie them to positive activities, but also organizations and institutions that may help them. In other words, these were like street corner counselors who worked with the young people and said, okay, well, you need, this will help you with your education. This can help you with get a job. This can help you with counseling. This will help you with health care. These are, and so it's called Operation Street Corner, and it was very successful in terms of decreasing gang activity and gang violence in the cities where these street corner counselors and workers were operating with the gang members. Okay, so in other words, it's putting, tying the young people to institutions in the larger society that can help them, that can advance them, but at the same time helping them in their daily lives as well. They were counselors, and so they had a problem with the police. They had this street corner counselor who knew them and could assist them when they did confront the police. And so that was a very successful program in the 1950s and spread to other cities, and it was, at various points in time, I get these emails and letters and things, so people say, oh, we read about your article on Operation Street Corner, and that's what we're going to do in our city. We're going to set this up, and we're going to have these people out there with the young people, working with the young people, providing them with alternatives to the street culture and drug culture and all of that, and have these workers. Now, and so they've done it. I mean, they've done it in more recently and stuff. Now, why was this stopped? Why did they not have these counselors on a regular? It was the unwillingness to pay the salaries of the counselors. It wasn't, the program was successful, but you had to pay, because a lot of times these were college students or college graduates. Okay, and we know that college graduates, so this was a program where college students and college graduates served as these counselors. And the problem was they didn't want to pay for the salaries of these workers. So that there are examples of programs where you could intervene and provide alternatives for the young people in those areas. I mean, you had various kinds of work studies program and manpower programs, et cetera. And those provide alternatives, but they no longer exist. And so we want alternatives to crime, to violence, and therefore decrease the incarceration rate.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin. So I think we have enough questions to keep you all afternoon. So, but I don't think that would be fair to you. So what I'm going to do, actually, let me just make a pitch for next week, and then I'm going to have one more question for you. So folks on the call, I hope you'll rejoin us next Sunday. And the questions that we don't get a chance to ask today, I hope you'll save them, because next Sunday we'll have Sari joining us for really a reflection on the dialogue that we've had today with Dr. Franklin. So first of all, hope to see you next week. Dr. Franklin, one other question that just came in that I thought was very interesting from Catherine Suarez. Thinking about it's very pertinent to our current situation with COVID-19, but really nothing new. The disparity in coverage and health outcomes for African Americans. What thoughts do you have in terms of thinking of that as a topic for reparatory justice?
Oh yes, it's clearly there is disparities in availability and access to healthcare. There's all kinds of disparities in healthcare, and I think that in terms of reparatory justice, it is the damage that certain corporations have done, not just to African Americans, but to Americans in general, that could be, that you can force them to, through protests and resistance, et cetera, to support a reparations fund that will deal with the health disparities in health. All right, just think in terms of big pharma and the opioid crisis and the activities of the state attorney generals to get settlements, make settlements with those drug companies to repair what? The damage that those corporations did to individuals and communities. Okay, and so the pharmaceutical companies are a target because we know that they have done great damage, and so you can have a mass movement. People say, okay, we are going to target these. You just figure out how the best way, what corporation, what are they tied to, what do they do, all your stuff, in order to have like a reparations super fund to support health clinics and in neighborhoods and these kinds of things. In other words, you know that these corporations have done all of this damage. And the problem is that when the attorney generals do, try to get settlements, compensation from these corporations, where does that money go? Does that money go to the individual families and individuals who were victimized by these corporations, or does it go into the state coffers? And so what we need is specific targeted programs and demonstrations and activities targeted at the pharmaceutical companies, and then placed in funds that would be available to people who have been victimized by these pharmaceutical companies. The state, when the state does it, it's sort of like like with the housing debacle, and the government went after these banks and stuff, that those fraudulent loans, et cetera, that they were, and the state got that. But what about the people? What about the people that would exactly, could there have been should there have been a reparations fund for those who were victimized by the subprime debacle in 2008? That was an alternative. The government went after those banks, but what about the people? What about the people that were affected? There should have been something set up to help those families and households that were victimized by these banks. And so all I'm saying is that we can target and create a fund, that people can apply to. And yet they say, well, how does this work? But but we know how to do this. The BP oil fund, the super fund, we know how to do this. We can call, you get the lawyers, et cetera, come in and evaluate application stuff. So we know how to distribute money, particularly in Louisiana. We know how we were victimized by this, and the lawyers came in and they decided, or people applied and they gave the money. It was out of the hands of the government. The government didn't participate in this. And we can do that in other areas. We can do that in other corporations and businesses that have done damage, set up a fund similar to that reparations super fund, and have families and individuals and organizations apply directly to it, rather than that settlement, that compensation going to the government.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin. So I think I'm going to pose one more question in the name of justice. So Jay Mallon had his hand up. He was the very first hand up. So in the interest of justice, Jay, I want to offer you the chance to pose your question if you'd like.
Okay. Part of it was covered, but Dr. Franklin, thanks for coming to join us from New Orleans. And because of where you are, I have to ask a question. Your church is in the 7th District, 7th Ward, I believe, New Orleans?
Yeah, so the Treme section.
Given that perspective, do you think that the climate justice and the racial justice are really separate issues, or are they pretty much overlapping?
They're overlapping. They're overlapping because because here the victims, the higher percentage of victims of the damage that's being done to the environment are poor African Americans and other people of color. I guess you've heard of Cancer Alley in Louisiana, and they are now trying to bring in another corporation to set up one of these fossil fuel burning corporations in the area along the Mississippi, where you already have Cancer Alley in existence, and you have the people, and so I have been involved with a group, Justice and Beyond. It's a local group that is protesting against these fossil fuel corporations and the damage that they've been doing to the environment, and that's where the two come together. It's because it is the people in Cancer Alley, there was an article in New York Times to say that Louisiana was the most polluted state in the Union. And that pollution is in areas where the population is predominantly Black. So in Louisiana, groups that I belong to are combined the issue of racial justice along with environmental justice.
Cool, thank you. Thanks, Bill.
You're welcome. So Dr. Franklin, thank you again for joining us. It's been a really interesting conversation. And
I'll send you the information on the book as soon as they produce it.
That's what I was going to say. So you need to let us know. And
that's what we want to create.
We would love to have you back once you're ready for your formal book launch. So
okay.
Anyway, thank you again. Thanks for folks for joining us. I'm going to leave the meeting up for a minute if anybody wants to share a comment or applaud or anything like that. But anyway, thank you for a wonderful dialogue today.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.